All right, good morning. I really got to test that. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh yeah, good morning. Good to see everybody. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. No, I did not send out questions. We're just going to do them together. And so as we get into this, I'll have the questions up here. And as you know, a lot of times my questions are just kind of get us thinking about some things, whether we answer them directly or indirectly. Thank Russ for covering class last week. He'll probably help me out with a few more. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Dan, would you direct our thoughts, please?
Lord, we're thankful to be here today together to worship you, to right now to study. Lord, be with Scott as he brings this message of the class to us, and that we participate, put it to work in our lives. Lord, we're just thankful for your son Jesus and your love you've shown us, that we would share that with others as we go about our week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, we're going to break this into two sections this morning. I want to look at 1 through 10, and then, Lord willing, we'll take the second half on Wednesday. I think we got a lot to talk about, another powerful passage from the Apostle Paul. So if somebody would read 1 through 10 for us, this will be our focus this morning. 2 Corinthians 6, 1 through 10. Who wants to do that? Who would like to read that for us? Read, please.
In working together with him, we also urge you not to receive the grace of God in vain, for he says, at a favorable time I will listen to you, and on a day of salvation I help you. Behold, now is a favorable time. Behold, now is a day of salvation. Giving no reason for taking offense in anything, so that the ministry will not be discredited, but in everything commending ourselves as servants of God, in much endurance, in afflictions, in hardships and difficulties, in beatings, in imprisonments, in mob attacks, in labor, in sleeplessness, in hunger, in purity, in knowledge, in patience, in kindness, in the Holy Spirit, in genuine love, in the word of truth, and in the power of God, by the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and left, by glory and dishonor, by evil reports and good report, regarded as deceivers and yet true, as unknown yet well known, as dying and yet behold we are alive, as punished and yet not put to death, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet not rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we wrapped up chapter 5, just kind of a quick summary. Basically, this is Paul's preaching of the reconciliation with Christ. If you look at those last couple verses in chapter 5, he says, we are ambassadors for God, making appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. This has been Paul's continual message. This is what Paul is living and dying for. We get into chapter 6 now, and some refer to this chapter 6 as Paul's resume, and see if that kind of resonates with you. Before we get into some of the questions, I do want to look at verse 1 and 2, or first part of verse 1, just for a moment. He says, once again, we working together with him. You know, sometimes I have a tendency to overlook some of these opening phrases because I want to get into the meat, right? But this is a very, very powerful statement, and I want to point out some things that kind of resonated with me, and I hope they do with you as well. He's emphasizing the weight of responsibility that he and his co-workers have. Working together with him, I think he's referring to Jesus there, right? So he's identifying himself that, keep in mind too, Paul is still in a defense of the gospel or a defense of his work. That's still kind of a thought that kind of carries itself through the whole 2 Corinthians. But what Paul is doing here is he's saying we are not independent agents. We're not working alone. We are co-laborers with Jesus Christ. And so the image that Paul is maybe getting us to see here is that they are really representatives, not self-appointed, but their labor is joined to one thing, and that's God's eternal purpose. That's it. Paul has one focus, and that's God's eternal purpose that God has revealed to him. Right? And then he uses, in this phrase, workers together with him. couple things came to my mind as I was preparing for this. And, the idea of we're working with Jesus. God doesn't depend on us. Now, hear me out for a moment. I've said that in my life. God's depending on me. God doesn't need Scott. God doesn't need you. However, God graciously invites us to participate in his work. And for me, that kind of changed the picture a little bit, to think that, where would we go if one of us can't do the work of the Lord? Who will spread the gospel? God's going to be sure that the gospel is spread. But he's inviting us graciously, I want you to be a part of this work. I want you to be a part of this eternal purpose. I think this is what kind of stood out for me. And so this term workers is very deliberate. It's a very deliberate term. When you think of the word work or you're hired to work, you know that you're not going to sit back idle, right? I mean, how many of the jobs have you gone to? I remember when I applied for a job years ago out of high school, I was going to work a construction job. I was going to be a hopper, meaning what I had to do was carry mud up ladders to get it to the guy's roofing and stuff. I got on the phone and this guy goes, "Are you ready to work?" "How old are you?" I said, 17, sir. He's all right. He says, "All right, you get up at 5:30 in the morning. Can you be here at 6? He says, "Because I don't mess around." And he did not mess around. In other words, he says, if you're going to do this, right, being a worker implies what? That we're going to invest ourselves in this. So when Paul says we are workers together, he's saying we are invested in the work of the kingdom. We are not spiritual spectators. And I hope that none of us are. There's a lot of good application from this text for us this morning. Right? Another thing that stood out for me, he does not say God works together with us, but he says we work together with him. I think that's another important distinction that Paul makes. And the idea here is the work does not originate with us. It's God's work. It's just another way of what I'm saying. It's God's work has invited us. How often have you, me, or somebody attempted to draft God into their plans? You know what I'm saying? Here's my endeavors, God. Let's do this. When maybe what God is telling us is, why don't you just discern what my will is and do that? And this is something that Paul really focused. It's a lesson for me to remind myself in my endeavors, I've got to be discerning what God's will is, not what Scott's will is or some other man's will is. And so I think the order here that I get from this phrase is discern God's will, understand, when we talk about being daily Bible readers, understanding the will of God, understand that, and then join that to his purposes. I get all that out of that first phrase. I think it's just very, very powerful. Now, he gets on there and he says, now he gets to this question, or appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. Be thinking about this first question here in a moment. This is a very urgent statement from Paul. This is a very serious statement because Paul clearly knows God's grace. He's out there persecuting Christians. We go back to Acts. He's out there persecuting Christians. We know, I think most of us, maybe not all of us, are familiar with the account there in Acts chapter 9. God basically stops him dead in his tracks and says, what are you doing? And through the next 3 days, Paul goes through a serious transformation. But Paul looks back on that event as God's grace. God could have destroyed me. But no, he says he knows God's grace. He knows that it's freely given. And he also knows, and I think this is the point that he's going to make here, we can squander that at any time. Any one of us here, any one of the Corinthians, Paul, his fellow workers, could squander that gift at any time by not producing fruits of holiness or obedience. And this is a deep, deep concern for Paul. All right, so Corinthians had received this grace, but he says, I want you to understand that it is possible to prevent the transformation that grace can have on you. This would be helpful if you're studying with those who believe in the grace only without works. this would be a great passage here to kind of help them understand that. This is what Paul's bringing out here. He goes, I don't want you to give in to the worldliness. I don't want you to give in to the complacency. I want you to let grace have its perfect work in you. So, this question, if you have some time to think about, what did you think Paul meant by that? What does it mean when he says, we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain? I gave you a few things to think about. I got a lot of stuff to say on it, but I want to hear what you have to say. As you're thinking about that, oh yes, Russ, please.
Well, I think it goes back to the end of chapter 5 where he's talking about being reconciled and the ministry of reconciliation.
Right.
So he's basically just saying, look, don't waste your time. You've been reconciled to God. Now just don't sit there and do nothing. Let's get about the business of the Lord.
Yeah, pretty much that summarizes it. Let's look at this a little bit more. If you have thoughts, let me know. So let's state what maybe the obvious here. He's not saying that they were never truly saved. That's a Calvinistic argument there. But that they could live in such a way that grace given to them produces little or nothing. Kind of going on what Russ said there. I think that's the idea of the vanity here. Over in 1 Corinthians 15:10, Paul says, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. And so Paul is kind of driving that point home that this grace given to me, all right, I was working in that. So a couple things that I think we can take away with the idea of grace here is, number one, we've used the phrase, grace is not a license to sin. Grace is also not a license to be inactive. Grace is not, I've got God's grace. I don't have to do anything. I might put it this way, it's an empowerment. Yes, Luke.
Well, maybe I'm skipping ahead. Sorry, Scott. You got question 3 up there on verse 3. And, what I like to think about is what I think Paul's thinking about is we want everyone to go to heaven. Right. 8 billion people on earth, you'd love for all of them to go to heaven. Doesn't matter where they're from, what they've done, and that's what God's saying. That's what Paul's saying is grace covers them all. Right. All 8 billion people.
That's right.
Can go to heaven, and he doesn't want to be the person to get in the way of that. He wants to help them get there, not be a hindrance to them.
Exactly. And he doesn't want them to do that. And you also made me think of something else. He still cares for these people who are accusing him. He doesn't want them to miss heaven either. Roy, do you have a thought?
I'm thinking about the first verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain.
Yeah. Very similar. Hold fast. That phrase, hold fast. If Paul had neglected this labor, all right, God still extended the grace to him, but he would be ineffective, unfruitful. So the grace freely given is meant to produce. It's meant to transform. It's meant for perseverance, which he's going to talk about here in a moment. So kind of wrapping up this thought here. Well, not yet. I got some more things I want to share here. Hang on a second. Paul, application for us. We trust the enabling power of the gospel. I believe we all do. We trust the power of the gospel, yet we still have to labor diligently. And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but I don't want to overlook what Paul's saying here. Trust the power of the gospel. Trust the power of grace to transform your lives, but you got to do something. And again, this is not a salvation by works issue at all. This is just it's got to empower us. And we got to have that daily reliance upon the Lord, which is absolutely essential. He quotes from, anybody know where he quotes from in verse 2? A little side note in your Bible there. Did you look it up? You didn't know you were going to be tested, huh? Isaiah 49, verse 8. In an acceptable time I have heard you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you. How many times have you heard this? I remember growing up, I heard this verse all the time. Now is the time, and they would close their sermon with this very powerful verse. And it's a good verse to close a sermon out with. I'm not arguing that. But Paul is using this verse from Isaiah to stress this point of grace being in vain even farther, all right? By looking at this prophetic promise, he's stressing what? When is the time for salvation? Let me ask you all. When is there a time of the day or month? What do you think is a good time for salvation? Anybody want to just shout out the answer? Anytime. Who said now? Whoever said now, yeah, now, anytime. Yeah, anytime, but yeah, his point now, behold, the word behold draws our attention. Behold, urgency is what he's saying here. God's grace is offered now. Remember, he's appealing to these Corinthians, coming off of chapter 5. He's appealing to these brethren that he loved. Salvation is when? Now. The call to labor is when? Now. Paul fulfilled all three of those. Here's a sobering thought, my church family. There's going to come a day when this opportunity is no longer present. Just let's give that some thought for a moment. There's going to come a day, whether it's by our departure or the return of Jesus Christ on that great and wonderful day for the believers, a dreadful day for those who do not fear God. There is going to be a day that comes where this grace will cease to offer. Carolyn.
Thinking about how often the run with endurance in the New Testament, how I see this connected to it.
Right.
Like you tap into Christ, and that is the start of the race. That's not the end.
Right.
And, 1 Corinthians 9 talks about a race. Hebrews 12:1, I think Philippians, 2 Timothy. It's scattered throughout the New Testament. And even in Hebrews 12:1, where it says, it's talking about a great cloud of witnesses, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And as I see that vision for myself in verse 1, to me that verse 2 where it says, I have helped you. Because when people run a race, it's not alone. And
right.
Even when you feel alone, God is there saying, I am there to help you through. When you're running up a hill and you feel like you can't make it, I'm going to be there with you.
Exactly. And I think that what plays the point when you said not alone. Number one, God is always with us. But just think about how many Pauls do you have in your life? People who encourage you. People who help you win the race. People who get in your face when you're getting off course because they love you so much. Everybody in this room has a Paul or Pauls in their life. Be grateful for them. Be ever so grateful. So to kind of add to this question here, to delay, to grow indifferent, to squander this grace, kind of comes back to what you said a moment ago, Russ, is to risk living in vain. That's what he's saying. Don't squander this. So now Paul is going to give us kind of a profound view of his ministry as Reed read that. I'm sure there were some things that kind of jumped off the page. We're going to see another list or a couple of lists from Paul here we're going to get into here in a moment. But Paul's words confront us with this question, the second question I have here, just food for thought. Am I making full use of God's grace, or are we receiving it in vain? Just a thought question. I'm not asking you to say yes. I just want you to think about it. I want you to just give this some thought before we move on and really look at Paul. Just take a moment and say, man, am I really? I would hope we're all answering yes. Do we fail at it? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. But I hope we never lose sight of this to make full use of God's grace. This time is short. It goes by fast. And before you know it, things begin to change and you're growing older and all kinds of stuff begins to happen. And you're going to look back with regrets. I've appreciated David Posey bringing this up a couple times when let me back up. Recently I read somebody says, I have no regrets in life. I'm like, really? Really? You don't have any regrets? Man, how long do you have for us to share with each other the regrets and the mistakes we've made? But guess what? We still have God's grace. We're still here. Beautiful picture. All right, let's move on to verses 3 through the first part of 4 here. Let's notice, again, this is Paul is stating the seriousness of his ministry is what's happening here. So he moves on here, verses 3 and 4. I'm going to go ahead and read that again. We put no obstacle in anyone's way so that no fault may be found with our ministry, but as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way. We'll stop there for a moment. Paul, this is probably the understatement, but Paul lived with a burning passion that his life, that his preaching would never bring reproach upon the gospel. It was a burning passion. We see this when we read his letters. You know, I know I brought this up there in Galatians. He says, if we or somebody else preach the word of God, let us be condemned. Let us be accursed. Always making that defense. So he says, we give no offense in anything that our ministry may not be blamed. Again, this doesn't mean that Paul was ashamed of the cross. I think that's probably obvious. He boldly proclaimed that message. But let me clarify this point. In 1 Corinthians 1:23, when he talks about the gospel, he says, to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Greeks foolishness. Right? That's because of the way they received it. It wasn't because of Paul's inadequacy. So Paul would never compromise truth to win favor. He could have looked, Jews, a stumbling block. How can I water this down so the Jews receive it better? How can I change some things so they might receive it? How can I help He didn't do that. He goes, here is the message of the cross. If you're going to reject it, if it's going to mess you up, that's on you. I'm going to preach that gospel. I'm going to preach that truth. All right, so he refused to let his conduct create any unnecessary obstacles. So, with your knowledge of Paul, how did Paul demonstrate this principle? What stands out for you in Paul's life? How did he demonstrate this principle of never compromising or never allowing the brethren or the world to hold something against him? Can you think of anything? Now, he's going to list a few things here. We could go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let me go over there real quick. 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 3. That's a really long reading, but we can check that out. 1 Corinthians 9, 3 through 15. We won't take time to look at that right now. But can you think of anything that Paul did? How did he demonstrate this principle by refusing? Well, here's one. He refused to take financial support. What did he do for a living? He was a tent maker. Now, Paul's not saying that preachers can't receive a stipend for preaching the gospel. Yes, Luke?
I just think he always made the opportunity, when he went somewhere, which was a different culture, he could have just said, you know what, you're Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm just going to walk away, nothing I can do here. But he did. He would go in a place and go, I see you have a statue, the unknown God, and he's going to make use of that and relate to them and go, I want grace for you. I want salvation for you. And he didn't give up on his values or what he believed to do that. He didn't betray God by doing that. He just related to someone and made the opportunity because he really wanted to save them. Right.
Paul had an amazing way of taking advantage of opportunities. Your example there, Acts 17, I think that is. Great example. He humbled himself. He allowed others to receive the glory. That was important to him. He was content to be viewed as weak and unimpressive if it meant that Christ could be glorified. Russ.
I was also going to say, kind of going like what Luke's saying there, is when it seems like he was constantly being harassed by the Jews, especially as he was going up around like the Thessalonica and Ephesus and those different places. And he just didn't say, forget it. This is too dangerous. This is too much work. this is going to cause me too much turmoil, I'm backing away from it. He just kept pressing on and pressing on.
Yeah, exactly. And just a huge, if there's one thing you take away from these readings, is Paul's perseverance, which we're going to talk about here in just a few moments. All right, I'm going to keep going here. So then he says that our ministry may not be blamed, recognizing, again, false accusations are going to happen. Let's face it, something, Christians. Our Christianity invites accusations. We know that. The fact that we are walking in the gospel, walking in the light, being defenders of truth, we are going to invite accusations, even maybe within our own family, let alone from the world and watching the news and feeling attacked sometimes, which sometimes I do. I'm thinking, really, man, Christianity's under attack. There's nothing new under the sun. We're not experiencing anything new right now. But many at Corinth, we brought this up. Russ brought it up again, and I appreciate it. Remember, there were still a lot of them. I don't think this was one person. There were a number in Corinth. They slandered his motives. They questioned his authority. They were doing anything to discredit him. And that can make somebody real vulnerable there. Start attacking your character. I don't know, man. I think I'd probably get up and start fighting. But I want us to notice how Paul answered this here in a few moments. All right. Again, his concern was that no true and righteous charge could be laid against him. You know, you could say, oh, I don't like the way you talk. Fine. I don't like the way you present this. Okay. I don't like the way you stand. Right? I don't like this about you. I don't like that about you. Paul's like, whatever. But when it came to the spiritual accusations, he stood behind the gospel, and he defended that vehemently till his death. So he lived this transparent, faithful life, ensuring that any slander would be exposed as those eyes of those discerning believers. Is there a lesson for us here? Hang on. Hit the next one here. That no fault may be found with our ministry. Is there any takeaways here? Anything jump off the page at you? Thinking about your walk with Christ. What is it? I mean, think about how we're supposed to live, right? Above reproach. What does that mean? We use that in the description of the eldership. What does it mean to live above reproach or to live blameless? Your thoughts. What comes to your mind when you hear that? Live your life above reproach. Or you'll hear the phrase, don't bring reproach on the church. What does it mean to live above reproach? Carolyn.
Well, for me, this is really intimidating because we do know we fall short at times, and is that possible to have no fault found with our ministry? Now, there's nothing we find about Paul that there's any faults anywhere.
Right.
You know, we can look at other people and see there was. But I think in general terms, it means that throughout whatever we do, the focus is on God. Right. And if we are shining God's light, that people will see that because they're going to see the beauty of God through our faults and maybe in spite of our faults. And so it's really about where are we directing people, and when we go through hardships, what is our attitude? Are we saying, oh, woe is me, or do we lose sight of what we're doing? Right. And not focus on God, or do we say, hey, I'm hungry, it's okay, God's got it?
Right. Yeah. Good point. Steve.
I think it means that we should have a good reputation.
Yeah.
Very short.
Yeah. Have a good reputation. So just to kind of share some more thoughts on that, living above, giving no valid reason for criticism. We're going to be criticized, as Carolyn pointed out. We're going to fall short of the glory of God. We know that, right? But we're not going to give a valid reason. It's like I said earlier, some of us here, even as a gospel preacher, I'm not going to share my stories. There were things that I was accused of, and I thought, really? Really? That's what you're finding on me? That, you know, and so you have to stay focused on this spiritual aspect. See, Roy.
Well, you're going to find criticism from somebody in the world. In the qualifications for elders, blameless, I mean, it can't be sustained.
Right.
It's just not there. You can make a charge, but you can't sustain it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we can find mistakes in people's lives. What the world does with that and what God's people does with that with two different things. The world's going to say, oh, you're this. Norm, then I'll come back to you, Dan. You're this. You're disqualified. Or whatever. How could you do that? Where a brother or sister in Christ can look at that fault, that error that's been repented of and say, all right, it's removed. Right, Norm? And then Dan.
Paul taught the gospel in every situation, good or bad. And he was fearless. But he was gentle enough to exhibit that fearlessness in a positive way.
Right.
For example, he stood before Felix, who could kill him. And he preached the gospel to Felix to the point where Felix says, well, are you trying to convert me?
Right.
Yeah, well, not only that, for everyone who reads that description of what he did, there is great encouragement because this man put it on the line to anybody and everybody at every circumstance and opportunity. And there's a way to do it, and he did it in that wonderful way. And so can we, if we think and practice it.
No threat affected Paul. Taking him to court, no threat at all. Dan.
Yeah, I think in our daily walk, right, we think about all those proactive things that we do daily, but it's also, I think, really important is our reactive when those situations arise around others that maybe put us in an obstacle or a time of stress.
Right.
Is how do we respond? And we aren't perfect, but that's a key point too. Is we think about all the things we are doing, what we're going to do, or we have done, but what happens in those situations.
Right.
I like that. How do we respond to these situations? Brady?
I just a little silly example, but I think it drives the point home. I don't drive without reproach. Like I don't do well on that, right? And that was non-problematic until I got to the position where I had to teach somebody in my family to drive. And then it all came out, right? And my ministry was blamed and continues to be blamed, right? And so, I think that's a good reason why we can't walk that way in our Christian life. If our goal, if we're not going to be taking the grace of God in vain, we need to be able to walk a certain way so that we aren't, pinned down with like, well, okay, we've come to terms with that, right? We have a workaround, but it does not work as effectively at all when you're trying to teach somebody something and you end up saying, hey, just do what I say and not what I do.
Your last statement there resonated with me. I don't know how many times Jody and I heard that from my dad. A lot of times jokingly, but a lot of times very seriously. I think that's a great example. I think that's a great example of the importance of living above reproach, because we've got so many looking up to us. They were looking to Paul. Yes, Russ.
Well, and it seems to me that what stands out to me here, and we're all talking about it, is just example.
Yeah.
And that as we grow as Christians, that gets to be something that's easily swallowed and accepted. But I know in my younger years, and maybe I still fight with it some, is, man, it's like, I don't want to be a good example in this. I just, and we've heard it from professional athletes that will say, I'm not the one that they should be idolizing. And it's just like, well, time out. We're all in that position. We're all in a place in our life where we need to be examples, good examples. And that's, to me, that's what Paul's talking about here. He said, I didn't put an obstacle in front of anybody. And it goes back to the idea of that we're blameless. It's not going to stick. So does that mean Paul was perfect? No. None of us are perfect, but it's not going to stick. So I'm going to look at that and say, well, that wasn't Scott. When he acted that way, that's not him. He had a bad day, a bad moment. Right. We can forgive that, and that's just not his personality. And I think we all kind of fall into that, but we do struggle with the point of being an example. And we do answer to one another. Ephesians 5:21 talks about that. Submit therefore to one another. Because our whole life is about submission, right? We submit it to Christ, we submit to the brethren, we submit to our leaders.
Yeah, exactly. This leads to this kind of a thought question. How did Paul and his companions commend themselves to God? How do we commend ourselves to God? So let's continue here. Again, the statement, in all things we commend ourselves as ministers of God. His ministry was validated not by the worldly standards of success. This is, I think, where Paul is going here, but by godly perseverance under trial or under affliction. And this is, we brought this up earlier, whether it was, I think, the last class that I taught, I brought up this idea or this thought of why we suffer. And I think this can help our understanding even more, why we suffer, right? We commend ourselves to God. The world's going to persecute it. We're going to suffer, but we can't forget, we're not commending ourselves to the world. Right? So that's what suffering does sometimes. We give in to suffering, and then we begin to commend ourselves to the world and pacify the world or make things stop. And Paul's saying, no, I'm going to commend myself to God. Now, he uses this word, somebody brought this up, this patience. This word here, just as clarification, does not mean a passive stoic acceptance. Well, I'll just sit here while the storm passes. Now, the word that Paul is using here is endurance marked by triumph. So his patience is marked by triumph. His patience is marked by endurance. It's not a resignation that just kind of folds its hands in despair. Look at it this way. It's the ability to face trials in such a way that the trial itself is transformed into a testimony of God's grace. That wasn't mine. I came across that, and I thought that was beautiful. I'm going to read it again. It's the ability to face trials in such a way that the trial itself is transformed into a testimony of God's amazing grace. What a perspective. Just to think about a trial in that way. I am being transformed to glorify God. As Carolyn pointed out, as I go through these things, I'm pointing the world towards God. That's our purpose, our goal in this life. And then he goes on. What do we got? We got about 7 minutes. In this verse, he talks about the afflictions, the hardships, and calamities. These are probably categories that encompass the general struggles that Paul went through. I'm going to highlight these because we're going to get into probably have to be on Wednesday now. These afflictions could be the external pressures, the afflictions that weigh upon the soul. We've all had afflictions. We've had hardships, maybe the constant lack of resources. When somebody's going through a hardship, what comes to mind? Maybe they lost their job or something happened. Man, they're going through a hard time. That would be a hardship. Calamities, not a word we use a lot, but the idea there is to feel trapped, to be backed into a corner that you feel that there's no way out. And Paul felt that at times. I want to make sure we understand that Paul was not exempt from these feelings. He felt them. There were times, I guarantee you, he felt alone, and probably had those thoughts. Is there going to be a way out of this? Remember earlier on, he talked about there was time, I forget where it was in 2 Corinthians, he talked about that near death. There were times Paul actually thought, this is it. Whew, take a deep breath. They're going to kill me. Right now, they're going to do me in. Look at this mob. Look at this riot what these people are doing. And he felt those moments, but those moments didn't define him in that moment. His trust in God did as he moved through those things. Any questions through 4? All right, let's look at the last couple. We got about 5 minutes. All right, so he gets into now endurance, resources, his divine perspective. So now he's going to kind of elaborate on these practical realities and then God's role in these. And we'll probably end up in the middle of this. But let me just kind of break these down into some groups. So he says beatings, imprisonments, and riots. Those are external pressures inflicted on him, right? So the beatings, was Paul beat? Do we know that? Yeah, he was left for dead. Paul was left for dead, wounded, his back receiving punishments, all for what? Standing for the truth. Imprisonments, we know that. We have Paul's prison letters his prison letters or prison epistles. We know that. He was confined, often unjustly. Acts 16, 2 Corinthians 11, we'll see this later. And then the riots. It depends on what version you're using. These were the violent outbreaks over what he was saying. I mean, can you imagine him preaching and then groups going at it? And that's what they were doing. They would go, you know what a riot is. We all know what a riot is, or something like that. His preaching was stirring the hearts of men where they were fighting one another. They were trying to get to him. You know, how many times was he rescued? Yanked from the, wow. He experienced these in Ephesus, in Corinth. So we'll close with this question. I don't know of anybody who has faced these trials. I'm talking about where Paul has. Now, I do know in other countries right now, there are Christians going through this right now as we speak. And I cannot fathom it. I'm sitting here right now enjoying peace with all of you. I really am enjoying this peace. So my question is, we may not face this type of physical assault, but what challenges do we face in our defense for the gospel? Yes, Luke?
Well, for me, it's just pride. I have a good friend from high school, I have a good friend from college, I have a good friend at work, and all three aren't Christians. And, I asked David Posey the other day, or a while back, I said, I'm just struggling on how to talk to them, because I used to not be a Christian later in life, and it was a struggle for me when people pressed me, and I don't want to push them away. I want to bring them to God. And so David just said, just ask them who they think Jesus is. Yeah. I think that's what Paul did. Paul just kind of he didn't press it. He just said, who do you think God is? Who is God to you? Right. And it's just a simple question that doesn't really put people on defense. It actually allows them to express how they've been feeling, because they have a worldview, they have a life experience that you just don't know until you ask. Yeah.
Excellent point. Any other attacks? Yes, Roy.
Well, some people become a Christian and they lose part of their family as a result of it.
Yeah. We get mocked. We get ridiculed. You don't have to raise your hand. How many of us are offended when we see just the moral compass under attack in the news? Yeah, there's times I can't do it. I just can't take it. I said I don't want to see another one of these things, And I'm not going to say it's a personal attack on me, but I guess in a way we could personalize it. I guess maybe I should withdraw that. It is an attack on us in our stand for truth. But we see this mockery, we see this ridicule, we see so much of this contempt from those who oppose what we stand for. And so what Paul is telling us is our endurance must extend not only to the physical, but to the scorn inflicted by society. Because you know what, and you know this, it wears you down, doesn't it? This constant barrage wears you down. That's why for me, I turn off the news a lot. It's just, I don't need it. I don't need it to see what's going on in the world today. I don't have to have these things. I check the regular stuff I need to check. One of them is weather. That's kind of an important thing to me, and a few other things. And then for me personally, I got to move on with my day because I will let it get to me. Russ.
Well, I think what a lot of that does to us is it causes us to be apathetic.
Yes.
And then finally we just kind of start shutting down. And it's like a friend said to me years ago, Christianity sometimes is the best kept secret. You know, so we just keep it amongst ourselves because we feel safe here in these walls or in the walls of our home. And why put myself out there? And that was not Paul's attitude.
Right. Was it, correct me on this, was it Jeremiah said they no longer blush at sin? I don't remember the passage, my apologies. But he says, he's talking to Israel, you no longer blush at sin. That's dangerous. And Paul says, don't lose sight of that. Thank you very much. We'll keep this going on Wednesday night.